Kia ora, good morning everyone, Richard Wong here, welcome back to the channel. Today we are looking at this new autofocus 85mm f1.4 lens from Meike. This lens is available for the Nikon Z and Sony E mount. The sample I received from Meike is for the Nikon Z, but I believe the optical formula is identical for both mounts. The launch price of this lens is $470 US. While it may not sound exactly cheap, it is significantly cheaper than the first-party 85mm f1.4 lens. It is also quite a bit cheaper than the other third-party 85mm f1.4 lenses like the one from Sigma or Samyang. But on the other hand, Meike's own 85 f1.8 lens for mirrorless cameras is just $200 US, which is much cheaper than this new lens. So in this video, we will have a look at this latest Meike lens performance with my usual image quality test, and I will also share with you some of my real-world sample photos and shooting experience. I will also do some comparison with the Meike 85mm f1.8 lens and see if this new f1.4 lens is really worth the extra price, or is it better just to get the cheaper lens instead and save a bit of money. One thing I mentioned in a lot of my previous Meike lens review is Meike lenses construction is usually a little bit plasticky. When I took this new Meike lens out from the box, I can immediately feel this lens is much higher quality than the previous Meike lenses. While I feel part of the lens still has a little bit of that plasticky feeling, but overall this lens feels a lot more premium and doesn't feel very budget anymore. After noticing the better build quality, the next thing I notice is that this is not a small lens at all. It's a pretty chunky lens, large diameter. It's also pretty heavy as well. I measured the weight of this Nikon version and it is 730 grams. Compared to the Meike's 85 1.8, also the Nikon version, which is only 360 grams, so this new lens is almost exactly double that. However, I have to say, holding these two lenses side by side, I just really prefer this 1.4 lens because the heavier weight and the different material they use to make this lens just make this lens feel so much more premium in comparison. At the front of the lens, we have the focus ring, which can be custom assigned to other functions through the camera if you want. The ring turns very easily, but the tactile feedback when turning the ring is still not that great. It's better than the Meike 85mm f1.8, but I think it could still be a little bit better. At the back of the lens, we have an aperture ring. The ring has a very nice texture, and that makes holding and turning the aperture ring very easy. When I first received the lens, I didn't really like the feedback when I turned the aperture ring. I can't really tell what's the reason, but it just feels something's just not very satisfying. But after using this lens for about 2 weeks now, I'm starting to like it more. It still feels quite different to the aperture ring on a lot of other lenses, but it is precise and easy to use. So maybe give me another few weeks and I may actually love it. On the side of the lens, there is a AF/MF switch and also a button that you can custom assign your preferred action from the camera. The button is quite large and the tactile feedback is pretty good. When I reviewed the Meike 85 1.8 lens a few months ago, one thing I complained is that lens uses micro USB port for firmware update. I really think no new product should use micro USB port anymore. I have even asked Meike why that lens still using micro USB port, and they told me their future lenses would use USB-C ports, and this time indeed This new 85 1.4 lens does use USB-C connector on the metal lens mount, so I'm happy. Another thing on the metal lens mount is a bright red rubber seal to protect the lens from rain and dust. I do not know if there are additional rubber seals inside the lens, but I have used this lens under rain a few times and I have no issues at all so far. I know the lack of weather seal is one thing that stops a lot of people from buying some affordable third-party lenses, so it's great we're starting to see weather seal on some of the more affordable third-party lenses like this Meike 85mm 1.4 lens. The lens comes with a reversible plastic lens hood that has a nice texture on it, and it doesn't feel flimsy at all, unlike the one for the Meike 85mm f1.8 lens. One more thing I want to mention is, Chinese optics companies, they usually don't pay too much attention to some small details like the font of the text they printed on the lens. A lot of times, they just use some generic fonts, or even worse, a few different fonts on the same lens, and that just make the aesthetic design of the lens not very polished. I have mentioned and complained about that in a few of my reviews a few years ago, but I then just starting to get used to it and can't be bothered to mention it again. But with this new Meike lens, I noticed all the text printed on the lens are using the same special fonts, including the front of the lens and even the small letters on the lens hood. Doing that definitely helps gives the lens a more polished look and make the lens feel more premium. This Meike 85mm f1.4 lens uses STM stepping motor for autofocus. The autofocus operation is smooth and quiet. Even when shooting indoor, there isn't much autofocus noise at all. While the previous Meike 85mm f1.8 lens also uses STM stepping motor, that f1.8 lens autofocus is quite a bit louder than this new f1.4 lens. I can hear the difference very easily when I'm doing side-by-side comparison. This is an internal focus lens, so the length of the lens doesn't change at all when you are adjusting the focus. Face detection works no problem as expected, and the autofocus speed is reasonably fast. It's probably not the best choice for shooting sports, but if you use it for portrait, it is definitely fast enough. Before we look at the image sharpness, I want to show you two side-by-side comparison photos shot with this new Meike 85mm f1.4 lens and the Meike 85mm f1.8 lens first. These two photos were shot using the same camera settings, but with the f1.4 lens at f1.4 and the f1.8 lens at f1.8. The photo from the f1.4 lens is a bit brighter and the background is slightly more blurred because of the faster aperture, but the difference is really not that big. The most obvious difference to me is the color temperature. Even though the white balance setting is set to sunlight for both photos, the photo from the f1.4 lens is quite a bit warmer than the photo from the f1.8 lens. The difference is pretty noticeable. The next thing is the field of view. The f1.4 lens is slightly wider than the f1.8 lens, even though they are both 85mm focal length. Now, the difference in colors and field of view is quite normal, and it doesn't mean one is better than the other, but I just want to point it out in case it affects your purchase decision. However, one thing I say the f1.4 lens is better than the f1.8 lens is the contrast. The f1.4 lens has much better contrast and also colors when I compare to the f1.8 lens. I suspect that is due to the better coating used on the f1.4 lens, which give it better flare performance. I will talk about lens flare performance a little bit more later on in this review. And now let's have a look at the image sharpness and look at the center of the photo first. If we zoom into the center, The Meike 85mm f1.4 lens center sharpness is quite decent at f1.4. You can already see a bit of moire pattern on my test chart. When we stop down to f2.8, the center sharpness becomes excellent. The center sharpness remains excellent until f16 when diffraction makes the image become softer. If we look at the corner, at f1.4, the corner sharpness is also pretty good, better than what I expected. And this is with the photo focus at the center of the frame. It suggests the lens has quite minimal field curvature, as otherwise the corner sharpness won't be that good at f1.4. The corner sharpness improves gradually as we stop down the lens. We reach the maximum sharpness at f5.6. But even at f4, the corner sharpness is already very good. If we compare this with the Meike 85 1.8 lens, the center of the Meike 85 1.4 is much sharper than the 85 1.8 lens. The difference is really quite big, especially at the maximum aperture. We need to stop down to f5.6, then the 85 1.8 lens can finally catch up the center sharpness. If you look at the corner, the difference is even bigger. Put the two photos side by side and you can see how sharp the corner of the Meike 85 1.4 lens is. With the f1.8 lens, you have to stop down to f8, then the corner sharpness becomes very good. Now once again, all these corner sharpness photos for the Meike 85 1.8 lens were shot with the focus set to the center of the frame. If I set the focus to the corner, then it will improve the corner sharpness of this f1.8 lens quite a bit, which suggests the Meike 85mm f1.8 lens has a bit of field curvature. The minimum focus distance of this new Meike lens is 98 cm or about 39 inches. And this is the photo I shot at the minimum focus distance. The maximum magnification is not too crazy, but this should be good enough if you want to do a tight close-up portrait shot. And if we zoom in this photo, the sharpness is very good already, even though it was shot at f1.4. Because of that, stopping down the lens doesn't really give us much improvement in sharpness. The Meike 85 f1.8 lens minimum focus distance is a little bit closer at 85 cm or about 33 inches, so you can get a bit higher maximum magnification compared to the f1.4 lens. However, the photos shot at f1.8 with this f1.8 lens at the minimum focus distance is a bit soft as well, and you have to stop down to f2.8 to get better sharpness. 85mm f1.4 is a traditional portrait lens, so the autofocus rendering or bokeh is one of the most important things for a lens like this. Some may even say the bokeh is the most important thing for a 85mm f1.4 lens in terms of image quality, as we all want to have a nice, beautiful background for our portrait photos. And I'm not disappointed by this lens at all. Background bokeh is really smooth, especially when shooting at f1.4. I don't see any onion ring pattern, and the transition at the edge is very soft. There is a little bit of cat's eye bokeh near the corner at f1.4, but it's nothing too crazy. I'm really happy with the bokeh from this lens. And let's compare some test photos shot at f1.4 with these two Meike 85mm lenses. I shot these photos one straight after the other, so it was all within a minute. The biggest difference is the color. As I've mentioned before, the photo from the f1.4 lens is a lot warmer. But if we ignore that and just look at the background, the bokeh looks really similar between these two lenses. Even if we zoom in and do some pixel peeping comparison, there is still not much difference. However, one thing is, with the 85mm f1.4 lens, I could shoot at f1.4 instead of f1.8. And if I do that, then I can melt the background a bit more than the 85mm f1.8 lens. It's not a huge difference as the maximum aperture is only 2/3 stop difference, but comparing the photos side by side, you should be able to see the difference. The background captured at f1.4 is just a little bit softer, but other than that, the bokeh from these two lenses are both very nice, and I can't really tell the difference even when I compare the photos shot at f2.8 or f4. We'll have a look at the vignetting performance now. At f1.4, vignetting is pretty noticeable with this Meike lens. Stopping down to f2.8 improves it quite a bit, but even at f4, there is still a small amount of vignetting at the very corner of the frame. You need to stop down to f8, then you can no longer see any vignetting. Comparing the f1.4 lens with the f1.8, while at f1.8, the vignetting is very similar between these two lenses. When I stop down the lens a bit more, it's actually the Meike 85mm f1.8 lens that has less vignetting than the Meike 85mm f1.4 lens at the same aperture. I wasn't really expecting that as the f1.4 lens is bigger and has a larger front element and filter size, so I was expecting the opposite. I was expecting the 1.4 lens would have less vignetting, but anyway, that's the result I got. When I did my 85mm f1.8 lenses comparison review, I found the Meike 85mm f1.8 lens has quite a bit of chromatic aberration, more than the other lenses that I was comparing with. But this time, with this new Meike 85mm f1.4 lens, the chromatic aberration control is much better. When looking at my real-world photos, I only see very little amount of color fringing. Even some of the more challenging photos that I expect to see quite a bit of green and magenta fringing, it still gives me very acceptable result with only very tiny amount of color fringing, even when I'm shooting at f1.4. So I don't think color fringing will be an issue at all with this 85mm f1.4 lens. And if you look at this side-by-side comparison with the Meike f1.8 lens, we can confirm this new f1.4 lens is indeed much better when it comes to chromatic aberration. Next, we'll have a look at the brick wall test photo and see if the distortion control is good or not with this new Meike lens. And I think the distortion control is pretty good. There is only a very small amount of pincushion distortion. The Meike 85mm f1.8 lens also has very good distortion control, maybe even slightly better than the f1.4 lens. But the amount of distortion is so minor for both lenses, I don't think it really matters even if you are taking a portrait photo in front of a brick wall. To me, lens flare performance is quite important for portrait lens, as I love shooting backlit portrait photos. So if the lens flare performance is bad, then it would really affect the ability to shoot those kind of portrait photos. Fortunately, the lens flare performance of this new Meike 85mm f1.4 lens is not bad at all. There is very little amount of lens flare even when the sun is in front of the lens, and the contrast usually remains very good. I noticed that when I was testing this lens side by side with the Meike 85mm f1.8 lens, there were many times when I have the camera on the tripod, the sun is in front of the camera. As soon as I switch from the f1.4 lens to the f1.8 lens, the contrast would become lower, and then when I switch back to the f1.4 lens, and I get better contrast again. And if you look at this lens flare comparison video, you can see that the f1.4 lens has less lens flare than the f1.8 lens when both are shooting at wide open. Sunstars is usually not the most important thing for a portrait lens. But hey, nothing stops us from using a 85mm lens for some landscape photos. Actually, I probably took more landscape photos using a longer focal length lens than using ultra wide angle lens myself. So anyway, let's have a look at the Sunstars from this 85mm lens. From f5.6, we can start to see some long, clean Sunstars from this 85mm f1.4 lens. The 12-point Sunstars becomes sharper as you further stop down the lens. Sunstars look very nice and clean at f16. If I compare it with the Meike 85mm f1.8 lens, the tails of the Sunstars from the f1.8 lens is spread out a bit and not really long pointy shape. You need to stop down the f1.8 lens a lot more to get the Sunstars to become sharp and long like the f1.4 lens. However, one advantage to the f1.8 lens is you can stop down to f22, while the f1.4 lens you can only stop down to f16. So the smaller minimum aperture helps makes the Sunstars sharper. But still, I think the Sunstars from the 85 f1.4 lens looks better, and you also don't need to stop down all the way if you don't want to. Let's have a look at focus breathing now. And this is my usual 1 meter to 15 meters focus breathing test. There is quite a bit of focus breathing with this new Meike lens. When I compared it with the Meike 85 f1.8 lens, the amount of focus breathing is quite similar between these two lenses. Both are quite noticeable. When I first heard of this new Meike 85mm f1.4 lens, the first question I had in my mind was, is the image quality good enough to make it worth the extra price? Well, looking at my test results, I think we can all say this new Meike lens is pretty sharp. Actually very sharp if you look at the center of the frame. Bokeh is beautiful, and there's very minimum amount of chromatic aberration, lens flare, and distortion. Even the Sunstars are beautiful, which is something I wasn't expecting at all. The side-by-side comparison with the Meike 85mm f1.8 lens shows this new f1.4 lens performs quite a bit better, especially in some of the key areas. So does it worth the $470 price? Is this lens really worth the extra money compared to the $200 Meike 85mm f1.8? And my answer is yes. If your budget allows you to get this new Meike 85mm f1.4 lens, I would definitely get it instead of their 85mm f1.8 lens. It's not really that much about the faster f1.4 maximum aperture, as f1.4 versus f1.8 is not really that big a difference, as you have seen in some of the comparison photos earlier on in this review. You can dissolve the background a little bit more and shoot the photo at a slightly lower ISO, which is good, but the main reason I would suggest this new f1.4 lens is because it is just a much better lens overall in terms of image quality, and the build quality is also a lot more premium. However, the downside is it is really quite a large lens, and at about 730 grams, it is also one of the heaviest 85mm f1.4 lens in the market. So this is not really the best choice if you want a lightweight travel setup. So what do you guys think about this new Meike 85mm f1.4 lens? Would you be interested in getting one yourself? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Thank you very much for watching this video, and remember to subscribe if you haven't already.